Good morning. We are now at the point of the story where Alec Bing is introducing Milo to the giant. Let's see what kind of giant this is. This was much too complicated for the bug to figure out, and Milo had just begun repeating it to himself when Alec said, "If you don't believe me, ask the giant." And he pointed to a small house tucked neatly between two of the largest trees. Milo and Talk walked up to the door, whose brass plate read simply, "The Giant," and knocked. "Good afternoon," said the perfectly ordinary-sized man who answered the door. "Are you the giant?" asked Talk doubtfully. "To be sure," he replied proudly. "I'm the smallest giant in the world. What can I do for you?" "We are lost," said Milo. "That's a difficult question," said the giant. "Why don't you go around back and ask the midget?" And he closed the door. They walked to the rear of the house, which looked exactly like the front, and knocked on the door, whose nameplate read, "The Midget." "How are you?" inquired the man, who looked exactly like the giant. "Are you the midget?" asked Talk again, with a hint of uncertainty in his voice. "Unquestionably," he answered. "I'm the tallest midget in the world. May I help you?" "Do you think we're lost?" repeated Milo. "That's a very complicated problem," he said. "Why don't you go around to the side and ask the fat man?" And he did, and he too quickly disappeared. The side of the house looked very like the front and back, and the door flew open the instant they knocked. "How nice of you to come by!" exclaimed the man, who could have been the midget's twin brother. "You must be the fat man," said Talk, learning not to count too much on appearances. "The thinnest one in the world," he replied brightly. "But if you have any questions, I suggest you try the thin man on the other side of the house." Just as they suspected, the other side of the house looked the same as the front, the back, and the other side, and the door was again answered by a man who looked precisely like the other three. "What a pleasant surprise!" he cried happily. "I haven't had a visitor in as long as I can remember." "How long is that?" asked Milo. "I'm sure I don't know," he replied. "Now, pardon me, I have to answer the door." "But you just did," said Talk. "Oh, yes, I'd forgotten. Are you the fattest thin man in the world?" asked Talk. "Do you know one that's fatter?" he asked impatiently. "I think you're all the same man," said Milo emphatically. "Shh," he cautioned, putting his finger up to his lips and drawing Milo closer. "Do you want to ruin everything? You see, to tall men, I'm a midget, and to short men, I'm a giant. To the skinny ones, I'm a fat man, and to the fat ones, I'm a thin man. That way, I can hold 4 jobs at once, as you can see, though I'm neither tall, nor short, nor fat, nor thin. In fact, I'm quite ordinary. But there are so many ordinary men that no one asks their opinions about anything. Now, what is your question?" "Are we lost?" asked Milo once again. Said the man, scratching his head. "I haven't had such a difficult question in as long as I can remember. Would you mind repeating it? It slipped my mind." Milo asked the question for the 5th time. My, the man mumbled. "I know one thing for certain. It's much harder to tell whether you are lost than whether you were lost, for on many occasions where you're going isn't exactly where you are. On the other hand, you often find that where you've been is not at all where you should have gone. And since it's much more difficult to find your way back from someplace you never left, I suppose you go there immediately and then decide. If you have any more questions, please ask the giant." And he slammed the door. He slammed his door and pulled down the shade. "I hope you're satisfied." "I hope you're satisfied," said Alec when they returned from the house, and he bounced to his feet, bent down to awaken the snoring humbug, and started off, more slowly this time, in the direction of a large clearing. "Do many people live here in the forest?" asked Milo as they trotted along together. "Oh, yes, they live in a wonderful city called Reality," he announced, smashing into one of the smaller trees and sending a cascade of nuts and leaves to the ground. "It's right this way." In a few more steps, the forest opened before them, and off to the left, a magnificent metropolis appeared. The rooftops shone like mirrors, the walls glistened with thousands of precious stones, and the broad avenues were paved in silver. "Is that it?" shouted Milo, running toward the shining streets. "Oh, no, that's only illusions," said Alec. "The real city is over there." "What are illusions?" Milo asked, for it was the loveliest city he'd ever seen. "Illusions," exclaimed Alec, "are like mirages." And realizing that this didn't help very much, he continued, "And mirages are things that aren't really there, that you can see very clearly." "How can you see something that isn't there?" yawned the humbug, who wasn't fully awake yet. "Sometimes it's much simpler than seeing things that are," he said. "For instance, if something is there, you can only see it with your eyes open, but if it isn't there, you can see it just as well with your eyes closed. That's why imaginary things are often easier to see than real ones." "Then where is reality?" barked Talk. "Right here," cried Alec, waving his arms. "You're standing in the middle of Main Street." They looked around very carefully. Talk sniffed suspiciously at the wind, and the humbug gingerly stabbed his cane at the air, but there was nothing at all to see. "It's really a very pleasant city," said Alec as he strolled down the street, pointing out several of the sights which didn't seem to be there, and tipping his cap to the passers-by. There were great crowds of people rushing along with their heads down, and they all appeared to know exactly where they were going as they darted down and around the non-existent streets and in and out of the missing buildings. "I don't see any city," said Milo very softly. And this is where we will leave it. Milo cannot see reality. Until next time.